Dr. Shashi Tharoor, as he shares his idea of India with us. And I'd also like to welcome on stage senior journalist and columnist Veer Sanghvi to take this conversation forward.
Hello everyone. I was asked to talk about my idea of India in as personal a way as possible, and I suppose in some ways it does emerge from my own life story. I was born in London. My parents moved back to India when I was 2.5. So I grew up in India, and I grew up all over, in Bombay, in Calcutta, college in Delhi. Then I went abroad to study, and I joined the United Nations, and I worked at the UN for 29 years, 1 month shy of that. And then I ended up deciding to come back to India. It didn't help that I had contested for the post of Secretary General of the UN and lost somewhat narrowly by a couple of votes. But as Groucho Marx would say, close but no cigar. So I came back to India. I mean, I was essentially always interested in politics. I've been elected president of the College Students' Union at St. Stephen's. I was elected the representative of the UN High Commissioner for Refugee Staff from voters around the world, and I got the highest number of votes. So there was always a certain willingness to put myself forward to represent people and speak for it. So when I was asked by the Congress Party whether I'd be willing to contest, I didn't hesitate, and I said yes. And in some ways it was a foolhardy answer because I had really no idea what I was getting into. I had actually left India to go to graduate school in America at the age of 19, and in those days the voting age in India was 21. So I actually hadn't even voted in an election, let alone come close to understanding what it took to contest in one. So it turned out to be the hardest thing I'd ever done, and I'd walked through minefields in Bosnia and refugee camps in Somalia, and I can tell you this was far, far tougher than anything like that. But at the end of the day, once it was done, I was in a position to truly claim I'd earned a mandate from the people. I took the seat from the Communist Party that had held it in the two previous elections, and I won with a very convincing 1 lakh majority in a 4-cornered fight. And from then onwards, I've been in Parliament. I've been re-elected a couple more times, so I've now served 15 years as the Member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, and in the process, I've been through pretty much everything that you can imagine can be done to a politician. I have suffered Agni Pariksha after Agni Pariksha. I've felt the impress of stilettos in my back as well as from the front, but I've stayed at it, largely because having taken such a major plunge, I felt it was necessary to actually come and stick to one's determination to make something of a difference. So that's on the personal front that they wanted me to speak about. But what was the India that I had left and I'd come back to? So as a kid already, you know, with I remember when I was going to the States, I wanted to stop in England on the way and see some friends and family. And I went to apply for a visa, or an entry permit as it was called in those days, at the British High Commission in Calcutta. And after a somewhat lengthy wait, I found myself summoned to the Deputy High Commissioner's office. And I wondered what had happened, you know. And when I went in there, I said, so what did I do wrong? And they said, nothing wrong. It's just that because you were born in London and all your papers are in order, we are able to offer you a British passport. And I said, I don't want a British passport. I just want a visa. They said, well, we cannot give you one because we're not entitled to give an entry permit to somebody who's entitled to a passport. So I said, how will I go? And I want to stop in England. They said, no problem. You just show your passport, keep a copy of your birth certificate handy, and they'll let you in. And it was a moment of very deep interrogation. Do I want to spurn? In those days, I'm afraid there were very many large numbers of our countrymen and women who would have done anything to get a passport like a British or an American one. And did I want to spurn that? And if so, why? And it's because, a very simple answer I found myself as a young man was when I look in the mirror, I see an Indian. But what did I understand by that? And that process of interrogation has occupied me for most of my adult life. I've written 25 books, most of which are in one way or the other scratching the itch of what it means to be an Indian. And in fact, that's part of the subtitle of a book I wrote called The Battle of Belonging. Unfortunately, during COVID, so it didn't get very much attention because obviously people weren't exactly going around buying books and holding book releases, functions, and discussing them. But I'm rather proud of that because that's where I think I came up with pretty much my most definitive answer. And that consisted of an interrogation into the whole notion of nationalism, where it evolved in Europe in particular, and from there, what it meant and what it came to mean in the 20th century, and finally what it means in India today. And one of the things you should all realize is that nationalism is really a fairly recent concept. It really is a 19th century idea, not much before that. The word may have existed and so on, but it didn't quite mean what we understand by nation or nationalism today. And nationalism in the 19th century is essentially about grouping people very much who are like each other in one way. So essentially, German nationalism was for people who were white, Christian, and spoke German. That was it. And of course, lived in a common territory. And the territory of people who fulfilled those three criteria became Germany. And in terms of France, the same thing. In terms of England, the same thing. You had certain basic requirements that involved ethnicity, religion, and language, and that's how you constituted a nation state to promote and defend those interests. Now, that obviously wasn't the Indian idea. Our nationalism grew up essentially, initially, as a classic anti-colonial nationalism in opposition to British imperialism. And then, at the climactic moment, if you like, of British withdrawal, what happened? The country was partitioned. And it was an era in which a lot of partitions happened. You may remember East and West Germany, North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam, all within a 5-year period. But in those cases, it was all over ideology. It was essentially the communist system in one half of the country and a welcome for capitalist economics in the other half. In India, that wasn't the issue. It was not an ideological conflict. It was instead a conflict over one simple question. Should religion be the determinant of our nationhood? And the Pakistanis created a nation on the basis that it was, that for them, their nationality determined their religion. But the people who were left behind, as it were, from Mahatma Gandhi to Jawaharlal Nehru to Maulana Azad to Dr. Ambedkar and everybody else around them, they had a very different answer to the same issue. They thrashed it out. There are 2.5 years of debates in the Constituent Assembly that are priceless, really worth reading and following. And in those debates, they actually thrashed out the question, okay, Pakistan's been created as a state for Muslims, why can't we create a state for Hindus? And they answered this question very, very definitively and clearly. This is the logic that had actually partitioned the country. We will not buy into this logic. Our freedom struggle was for everybody. We will create a country for everybody. And the Constitution actually enshrined this idea of India by guaranteeing that everybody, irrespective of their caste, their creed, their color, their culture, their cuisine, their convictions, whatever, they, as long as they were citizens of India, they all had the same rights as everyone else. And that made all the difference. It was what one might describe as not a classic European-style nationalism. It was instead civic nationalism. Civic nationalism is nationalism that actually is anchored in a constitution and in institutions, and not an identity, neither ethnic, nor religious, nor linguistic. And so we had all sorts of ethnicities in our country. We had every conceivable religion in our country. We had every, 28 different languages spoken by more than 35 million people. No problem. All of them could coexist. Everyone was equal. That was the India to which I had felt a strong sense of allegiance. I grew up in such an India. I went to school in Mumbai, and as a children of nationalist parents, my father had even dropped his caste name at the time of college, it was around the time of independence. And they never ever mentioned the religion or anything else about the kids who came home to play. And I later realized, when I became conscious of such things, that indeed, as was typical in Mumbai, that essentially I had friends from every imaginable religion. There were Christians, there were Muslims, there were Sikhs, there was Parsis, obviously, and there was even a Jew. And they had all come and gone, and no one had made any comment about their background because it wasn't supposed to matter. That was the India in which I grew up. That was the India whose image I cherished in my own mind. When I started writing about India while sitting abroad and being invited to speak, this was the India that I spoke of and projected. And I used to come back home to India every year on vacations, and I thought I continued to see that sort of India. There was one major spasm of setback, 1992, the whole culmination of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and the violence that ensued and the destruction of the Babri Masjid and the violence that followed that. And all of that, of course, seemed to be a challenge to this very idea, and yet India overcame it and continued, as we saw in the following years, just that way. So when I returned to India in 2008, I thought I was coming to an India that in its essence had not changed from the India I grew up in. Yes, maybe it was possible that a lot of superficial changes had occurred. Certainly, I left in India where you couldn't see a foreign car or a washing machine or very many consumer products that originated in the West, and that when we were NRIs, we were importuned to bring back home. All that was gone, everything was available and so on. That was a major change. But the other change that we have seen since had not yet occurred. And so I really came back to an India that seemed to me very familiar, pluralist, diverse, celebrating its own uniqueness. And in fact, I had a first-hand example of that as a UN official traveling in the Gulf countries in 2004, just after our elections of that time, and just after the government had been formed. Will you do this for me? Sorry, it's a bit of a struggle. Thanks. And at that time, what happened was that in the Gulf countries that I was traveling to, the various ministers and senior officials I met were utterly astonished and admiring, I might add, that our elections in 2004 had produced a government led had given a victory to a party led by a woman born in Italy, a white person of Catholic descent, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in by a Muslim president as prime minister in a country 80% Hindu. And when they mentioned all this to me, I looked at them and said, don't you understand, we are just like this. Or as we say these days in India, we are like this only. It had nothing to do with us trying to impress the world in any shape or form. This is the country we are. So that was just 2004, so 4 years later, I didn't think very much had changed. And indeed, I would argue it hadn't. But then, of course, we saw the dramatic transformations of the last 10 years. And that's where my idea of India seems to be obviously very clearly under threat. That is, or under challenge, which is that instead of an India for everybody, an India of civic nationalism, we instead have an India in which essentially we seem to be seeking a return to an ethno-religious, linguistic kind of nationalism. That is encapsulated in the famous slogan, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. And the problem with that is that there's 20% of the people who aren't Hindu. There's 52% of the people who don't speak Hindi. And of course, there's half the country territory that is not part of Hindustan in the old sense of that term. And if we are going to privilege that particular area, the so-called Hindi heartland, over the rest of the country, and its values, its beliefs, its religious preferences, its language, what are we going to be doing to the idea of India? And this is why this whole phrase has come in. It was a phrase that Tagore used first decades ago. Then Amartya Sen delivered a famous lecture in Oxford in the early 90s with that title. And of course, Sunil Khilnani made it famous with his book. But that was essentially the idea, if you like, encapsulated in the Constitution. Now, there was always room to contest it. I have no difficulty with the notion that the idea of India that I have may not be the idea of India that you have, and you have every right to propagate and advance your idea. But I used to feel that my idea was actually more reflective of the realities of the country, and at the same time also more reflective of the way in which we lived for the most part. And that's why I decided that I wasn't going to be compromising on my idea, and I was going to defend it as much as I could. Now, I was given 10 minutes, and I think I've hit that mark, so let me try and wrap up at that point. But that's essentially it. There are ideas of India in contestation. I see a very clear cleavage between the civic nationalist idea of India and the ethno-religious identity markers of India. Do we have a nationalism anchored in identity? Do we have a nationalism anchored in a constitution and in democratic institutions? That's got to be the key issue that we all confront. I believe that the India I came back to was the India that I had seen and grown up with and been taught about and read about and valued coming from the days of the Constitution. And I asked myself, is this surely not worth defending a bit more vigorously as an alternative idea begins to gain ground? I'll stop there, and I'm sure as we talk, Veer and I will explore this further. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shashi. Actually, you spoke for 21, but that's fine. I had to listen to you for another 15. You were very good. That means there's 9 minutes left, not that you've spoken for 9.
But they only had 25 on the clock, for whatever reason.
Well, listen, you were brilliant. I would have listened to you for another 15 minutes if you'd spoken. Quick questions. One, you came back because you believed in a certain vision of India. Did you realize then how fragile that was? Did any of us?
No. I genuinely believe we took it for granted. That may be why it's so easily challenged, is because we were complacent about it. We just assumed that everybody accepted this idea of India.
Let me give you the alternative argument, and this is an argument leveled by people who have a different idea of India. And while we talk about ideas of India, essentially there are really only two ideas. One is the Nehruvian, Tagorean idea that India is an country that you can sign up for. You don't have to be black, white, round-eyed, slit-eyed, Hindu, Muslim, whatever. And the other is the idea that Advani made famous in the 1980s, which is this is a Hindu country. There is no shame in accepting that. Muslims are welcome to live here, but they should know they're living in a Hindu country. I mean, these are essentially the two poles, and there are little bits in between and some extreme versions even saying that Muslims can only live here as our guests if we want them to, etc., etc. Given that there are these two completely different visions of India, why do you suppose so many people who seemed, at least in the 90s and till 2004, quite happy with the first idea of India, why do you think they've changed?
Well, first of all, you're quite right. It was an idea you could sign up for, and it's interesting how many white people did.
Yeah.
J.B.S. Haldane became Indian. My professor at St. Stephen's, David Baker, is a white Australian, applied for, and people couldn't believe him in those days in the 70s. Imagine somebody willing to give up an Australian passport to become Indian. But he believed in this idea. He was a historian of modern India, and indeed he became Indian. And there are other such cases. I've written The Battle of Belonging about a friend of mine who was born Pakistani, but rejected the two-nation theory and sought and won an Indian passport eventually. So you've got people who believed in the idea, fought to be part of it, and wanted to be. And then, as you rightly said, there is this alternative idea, which I believe is actually a falsification of history, in the sense that it's been a very, very, very many centuries since India was purely a Hindu country. There were always other forces in as well, if you're looking purely at religion. And at the same time, and I'm a proud Hindu, so I'm not saying this out of any sense of an outsiderness, but as a Hindu, I grew up believing passionately in precisely the Hindu acceptance of difference that makes a difference between Hinduism and other faiths. Swami Vivekananda used to quote the Shiva Mahimna Stotram all the time, which said that just as many rivers flow down many hills and valleys in different directions, some straight, some winding, and end up in the same sea, so also all forms of worship end up at the same divine. And that idea meant that he had a phrase in his famous speech in Chicago where he said that I'm proud to speak on behalf of a religion that has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance. And that kind of threw me, Veer, because I had gone to school like anybody else in India, learning in history class that tolerance was a virtue, that a tolerant king is a good king because he allows other people to disagree with him and so on. But what I think Vivekananda understood very well was that tolerance is basically a patronizing idea. It essentially says, I have the truth, you are in error, I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. Whereas what Vivekananda says is something very different that he believes Hinduism stands for. The Hindu says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. Yeah. And this is what the essence of the acceptance of difference is all about. And frankly, it was a wonderful recipe for coexistence in a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural country, which is what we were and had always been for centuries before. To my mind, therefore, this whole notion of it being a purely one religious country that everybody else here has to live in on sufferance, or as a guest or as an interloper. Golbalkar had an unkind word. He said, they're either our guests or they're bandits who've broken into our home, and we have every right to expel them. That kind of language, that is extremely un-Hindu if you follow Vivekananda's teachings, as well as those of Mahatma Gandhi and other modern interpreters of the faith.
There is, in this whole objection to secularism and that original idea of India, also a subtext. And that subtext is that this idea of India, that everyone is an Indian regardless of religion, is a Western construct done by people with a Western education. Nehru is usually held up as an example of that. And therefore, we as true Bharatis or Bharatiyas would reject that. Many people would see you as epitomizing that kind of educated Western person, not realizing that you actually go out and win Lok Sabha elections time after time, mainly because you're not seen as a Hindi speaker and the new nationalism is very Hindi focused. Is that fair?
I don't know. I don't think that criticism of me on those grounds would be fair at all. But I'm just going to say that I don't really think this is a Western idea. Yeah. I think in many ways, as a Hindu, and you can read my book, Why I'm a Hindu, for my exposition of this, it's a very Hindu idea. There's this if you look at the original concept of the divine in Hinduism, the Brahman, this was essentially no different from today's Islamic concept of God. That God is someone you can't, or something you can't imagine, can't see, has no form, no shape, no smell, no touch, no gender, and therefore they cannot be. It is called the Nirguna Brahman, the God without qualities. That was the Brahman that we all were supposed to worship. But after a few centuries, when it was very clear it wasn't enough for ordinary people. Ordinary people were worshipping trees and rivers and mountains because they wanted something to focus their worship on. And that's when the rishis came up with the concept of the Saguna Brahman. They said, all right, fine. In that case, you want something you can look at and imagine God to be. But then since no one really has any claim to any one authentic version of God, since no one has seen God and lived to tell the tale, why don't we actually allow you to have any form of God that you choose to worship? And that's why we have 330 crore names of God and attributes. And these are the material manifestations for our limited human imagination of what the immaterial, spiritual, the spirit, as it were, of the Brahman is all about. And so if you want to imagine God as a pot-bellied man with an elephant's head, you're free to do so. You want to imagine God as a 10-armed woman riding a tiger, you're free to do so. And by the same logic, if you want to imagine God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that is fine too for the Hindu. That's the root of Indian secularism, as far as I'm concerned. And to say this is all Western thinking is actually a denial of some very real, profound philosophical inquiries going back 2,500, 3,000 years in our Hindu faith.
A final question, because we're nearly at the end of our time. If you look at societies where prosperity has grown, if you look at, say, Western Europe, religion becomes less and less important. The number of people who go to church in England is at a historic low. Even in America, despite fundamentalism in some of the South, in much of America, fewer and fewer people go to church. Why is it in India that as prosperity has increased, so has communalism?
Well, first of all, Indians never went through much of irreligion. I mean, there were obviously a handful of people who called themselves agnostics and so on. But there was a study done by the Pew Polls, you know, the global polling organization. And I think they established that Indians were the most religious country in the world. Something like 98% of Indians claimed allegiance to a religion, whereas I think the comparable figure in most Western countries would be south of 70 odd, and in some cases very much lower than that. So India was always a religious country, which is why I'd argued even in the political space that we should not be confronting the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and the revival of this Hindu fundamentalism, which is an absurd term because Hinduism has no fundamentals in that sense. But anyway, we should not be contesting it as godless secularists. We should be contesting it from within the prism of religion, because that's where people live, that's where people are, and that's what they believe. Now, that's not always an easy argument to make, and I know that Why I'm a Hindu continues to be read widely. It's a fairly successful book, but it has had very little impact on our politics as such. Having said that, when you say, why have we become more communal, I think there is a purely political explanation for that that goes beyond religion. Politicians for decades have been looking for identities to mobilize votes around. It may have been caste at one time, the cliche of, you know, when you cast your vote, you vote your caste. And now it's also become religion. And because, again, when people started voting on caste lines and the Hindu community was thereby divided, clearly the BJP decided that it made a lot more sense to try and homogenize the Hindu vote by appealing to a collective identity that transcended caste. So it's become an instrument of mobilization, but unfortunately in the process there is a demonization of others. And that demonization is what has led to what you've called communalism. I'm obviously sort of deeply dismayed about this, because on the one hand, I don't want to surrender my Ram that I prayed to since my childhood to the BJP. The BJP has no copyright on Ram or any other manifestation of God in the Hindu concept. At the same time, we don't want to do it in the BJP's terms. I mean, the Prana Pratishtha ceremony was the conversion of a temple into a political stage. I go to temples to pray, and I will go one day to pray, but I will not go when the event is being presided over by a political leader for a political purpose. That's the difference, really, as far as I'm concerned.
Final, I know I said last question, but I have to ask you this because you brought it up yourself, which is, haven't you chaps painted yourselves into a corner because you are now committed to being godless secularists in your opposition to the BJP? Because the moment you say we are Hindus and we respect that, we'll go to a temple, the so-called liberal media will say this is soft Hindutva.
But, you know, that's not it. I believe Hindutva has actually not only nothing to do with Hinduism per se, it's actually in many respects anti-Hindu. The Hinduism that I've described to you, which is the religion of acceptance, of acknowledgement of diversity, of freedom of different forms of worship. Hindutva is a political doctrine that explicitly denies all those things. So we have to understand that we can't subscribe to Hindutva, whether soft or hard, but we can certainly debate interpretations of Hinduism with well-meaning people. There's no problem with that. I'm very happy to do so. But to my mind, the real issue is not that. The real issue is the weaponization of a Hindu identity, not the Hindu religion, of a Hindu identity for political purposes. And that we have to fight.
So that's the next book, Why Hindutva is Not Really Hindu.
But I've more or less said that in my book, Why I'm a Hindu. Do read it.
All right.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. I think many in the audience will agree with me when I say that you've wonderfully articulated and embodied the idea of a pluralistic India. So thank you very much for that. And also many thanks to Mr. Veer Sanghvi. Please do stay on stage as I invite Jogesh Bhutani, co-founder Nexus Alliance, and also Pushant Chakrabarti, CFO ABP Network, to kindly present Dr. Tharoor with a memento from Ideas of India. I think it will be great if you all can be together, Mr. Sanghvi, for the photo op. Please join them. A big round of applause, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanghvi. Once again, a wonderful conversation that you've held, giving us a lot to think about. Thank you all very much, gentlemen. Thank you indeed, and please do remain on stage.